My first wound. At twilight, before the nightly exchange of fire, we emerged from our bunkers and took a seat in the grass behind the trench line. We wanted a breath of fresh air, have a chat with our comrades, and dream a bit about those we'd left at home. Romanov was sprawled out on the grass beside me. He was dozing. Sergeant Akimov picked up the handle of a mess pot with a bayonet, brought over some porridge, set the pot on the ground and said, "Eat. Today I've prepared some grub better than our own wives could do it. You'll lick all 5 fingers and the palm of your hand separately." We ate with gusto, burning our lips with the metal spoons. To the left of us, shells began to explode, forcing us to crawl back into the trench. Artillery fire added to the mortar shelling, and we heard planes overhead. We waited for a night attack by the enemy, but no attack came. Enemy activities on our sector of the front became spasmodic and feverish. Sensing the growing strength of our resistance, the commander of the German Army Group North, von Lieb, despite enormous losses, hurled more and more fresh units into the attack in the effort to take Leningrad. Despite the constant firing and shelling, in the intervals between attacks, many of us managed to sleep soundly while crouched and leaning against the walls of the trench. We normally woke to the shouts of "Germans." We would become instantly awake and our eyes would start searching for the enemy. One day, Romanov and I were standing next to a turn in the trench. For the first time, I saw sorrow on my friend's face. Romanov spoke up. "Buddy, if something happens to me, promise that you won't say anything to my mother. Her health is so poor." I replied, "And what do you think? My heart is armoured." Just then, enemy tanks appeared. Romanov shouted, "Tanks!" Everyone in the trenches woke up instantly. The tanks were attacking in formation, advancing at high speed and firing from their cannons and machine guns. The infantry followed in their wake, running and firing on the move, disappearing into the tall rye, falling, rising, and shouting their "Leah, Leah, Leah!" Shells flew overhead with their piercing shriek. We didn't know whose they were. But when the turrets of the enemy's 3 leading tanks flew into the air, everything became clear. Our heavy artillery had come to our aid and was firing at the enemy vehicles over open sights. This was the first use of large-caliber artillery in a direct-fire role against tanks on our sector of the front and yielded splendid results. Now all our attention was concentrated on the enemy infantry. We opened a storm of fire on them and became so focused in the task that we didn't notice the growing rumble of engines behind our trenches. Even now I remember how one iron behemoth clattered just past my head. Coming to my senses and shaking off the dirt, I took a look. They were our T-34 tanks. They bounded over our trenches and attacked the enemy vehicles head-on. For the first time, I watched a tank battle flare up. It lasted for only 10 or 15 minutes, but left terrible traces behind. The rye, the grass, bushes, even the earth itself was burning, coated with benzene and motor oil. The highway between Kingisepp and Krikovo changed hands 12 times during the day. It seemed as if the day would never end. Then once again we hurled ourselves into a counterattack. The Germans flinched and began a disorderly retreat. Only a soldier can fully appreciate this turning point in battle. With the sight of the backs of his enemy, his strength multiplies tenfold, his courage knows no limits, and he no longer hears the shell explosions and the whistle of bullets. He sees only the enemy and fires at him until his target falls to the ground. Kruglov was running in front of the company with a pistol in his hand. To the left and right, a loud "Ura" rang out. At this climax of the fighting, I suddenly felt as if I'd been scalded with boiling water, and I tumbled to the ground. In my battle frenzy, I immediately jumped back up and ran another 100 meters or so, and then felt a burning pain in my left leg. I suddenly felt nauseous and became weak. I swore loudly, sat down, and automatically began running my hand over my left leg. I felt a sharp shell splinter, still hot to the touch, sticking out of my shin. I tried to pull it out, but the fragment was firmly embedded in the bone. Not far away, I saw a deep shell hole, still smoking from the shell explosion that had created it. I slithered over to it on my belly and slid to the bottom of it. My vision began to grow dark. I took a few gulps of water from my canteen. "Why have you taken shelter here?" I looked up. An unfamiliar soldier was standing on the edge of the crater. "They've hit me in the leg, the vermin." The soldier shouted for a medic and then ran on. Soon an older medic leaped into the crater. Glancing at my wound, he quickly cut the leg of my boot with a knife and vigorously plucked the fragment from my shin. I saw stars from the pain. With skilled hands, the medic bandaged my wound and told me, "Rest a bit, buddy, and then make your way back to a medical tent." When I reached the medical station, they applied some sort of ointment to my wound, gave me some hot tea to drink, and I fell asleep. How much time passed while I slept, I don't know, but when I woke up, it was dark. Someone nearby was moaning loudly. Suddenly I felt the touch of someone's hands. Thinking that a wounded man wanted a drink, I detached my canteen from my belt and offered it to him, but he didn't take it. Instead, he silently continued to move, his hands over my head, face, and chest. I found some matches in my pocket and struck one. A fellow with a bandaged face was lying next to me on a stretcher. From his dress, it was difficult to determine who he was. I saw several other wounded with me in the tent. A nurse entered. In a motherly voice, she said tenderly, "Just a bit longer, dears. An ambulance will come soon." I asked her who this man with the wounded head was, who was persistently resting his hand on my chest. The nurse didn't know. In order to ease the suffering of this fellow, I lightly gripped his hand. He settled down a bit and seemed to fall asleep. However, as soon as I removed his hand from my chest, he began to search for me again. It was clear that my neighbour was afraid to remain alone with his bandaged eyes. A vehicle roared up, and a doctor and 2 stretcher-bearers entered the tent. The doctor pulled out a list and began to call out the last names of the wounded. I could feel my neighbour's hand begin to tremble on my chest. "Pilyushin!" the doctor called out my last name. The wounded man lying next to me crawled off his stretcher, hastily grabbed me with both hands, and said something that I couldn't make out. I carefully placed the wounded man back on the stretcher. He wouldn't let go of me. Just then I heard, "Romanov, Petr." I shuddered, as if from a strong blow, dropped to my knees next to the stretcher, and firmly embraced my combat friend. The nurse, standing over us, began to cry, and the doctor turned away. The stretcher-bearers silently looked at Romanov's bandaged head and scowled. I tried to soothe Romanov. "Petya, friend, get better. We'll meet again, and together we will fight again." The doctor silently shook his head. I thought to myself, has Petr Vladimirovich Romanov really fought his last battle? Through tears, I watched as Romanov was carried away to the ambulance. The sun began to set. A light rain was falling. The sounds of combat began to fade into silence, but medics were continuing to bring in the wounded. Several groups of German prisoners were escorted past the medical tent. Sergeant majors and cooks were bustling in the woods, in the clearing, and around the field kitchens. They were rushing to send a hot meal up to the front lines. Artillerymen were changing the position of their guns. I limped over to the dirt road and took a seat on a stump. There I began to wait for a medical cart. I don't recall whether I fell asleep or just became lost in thought, but I didn't hear it when a 2-wheeled medical cart pulled up. "Hey, brother, are you wounded?" Shaking me gently, an elderly medical attendant was addressing me. I replied that my leg was wounded. The attendant helped me over to the cart. "It's nothing, friend," he encouraged me. "Your wound will heal, but we slaughtered a lot of Germans today." "And our brother spilled a lot of blood," said a Red Army soldier with a weathered face who'd been wounded in the arm. The thought of Petr wouldn't leave me. Would I really never see him again? The return. I spent 2 weeks in a field army hospital recovering from my wound. The Politruk's news and the summaries from the Information Bureau gave us little comfort. Our forces were still retreating into the depth of the country, towards Moscow and Leningrad. On 16th August, The enemy cut the Moscow-Leningrad railroad in the area of the town of Budagoszcz. The Nazi generals were trying to cut all the lines of communication with Leningrad as quickly as possible, in order to hinder the evacuation of industrial equipment and people into the interior of the country. Savage fighting developed on the ground and in the air on a narrow sector of the front, which extended from Munga Station to the shores of Lake Ladoga. On our sector of the front, in the area of Volosovo Station, the enemy's advance was almost brought to a complete stop. This revived our spirits, and we were expecting similar news from other sectors. The adversary was still powerful, however, suffering heavy losses in men and material. The Germans continued to make penetrations into our lines here and there and forced the Soviet forces to retreat. My wounded leg healed and was now almost no longer hurting, but my heart constantly ached, because I knew the danger facing my native city and my family. During one morning check of the patients, the old, stooped, wrinkled doctor with the kind, fatherly eyes was walking from bed to bed. He was asking each wounded man one and the same question. "Well, how are you feeling?" "Discharge me, doctor. I'm fine now." "Don't worry, now I'll take a look and I'll tell you whether or not you're well." "No, dear fellow, you're not fully healed, but we'll do what we can for you." He took a close look at my leg as well. "Your wound has healed," said the doctor, "but you'll still have some pain in the leg." A nurse placed a check mark next to my name. This meant that they were going to discharge me. I said goodbye to the other guys in the ward, put on a new uniform, slung my sniper's rifle over my shoulder, and went outside. It was 27 August. The sun was high in the sky. The leaves on the trees were limp, while the grass was wilted. The air was hot, like inside an oven. Having made my way on foot past the Glukovo State Farm, I sat down on the side of the road and started to smoke while waiting for a passing vehicle. My shin was hurting and my toes felt numb. Needing my leg, I recalled my frontline friend Petr Romanov. Where was he now? How was his treatment going? I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. A truck coming from the direction of the forest was kicking up dust. I raised my rifle over my head, the driver slowed, and the truck came to a stop next to me. "Going to the front?" the driver asked. "Give me a lift, it's tough for me to walk." "Climb into the back and keep an eye on the sky. If you spot any vultures, slang reference to German planes, let me know." I climbed over the side of the truck, settled down comfortably among some boxes, and the truck set off in a cloud of dust. The driver drove quickly, skillfully manoeuvring around the shell craters. When we reached the outskirts of Gubanitsi, enemy fighters appeared overhead. The driver parked the truck under a spreading maple, hopped out of the cab, and asked, "Where are you going, brother, to Luga or Volosovo?" "To Volosovo." "Then he'd straight ahead on foot. I'm going to Kudanki." He glanced up at the ski and gestured with his head at the circling planes. "I don't know if I'll manage to get past them, but I must. The anti-aircraft gunners are waiting for the ammunition." The driver was silent for a moment and then gave a sly smile. "It's nothing. I'll give them the slip. This isn't the first time I've encountered them." I remembered the sly smile on the broad, sunburned face of this Russian soldier for a long time. Having thanked the comrade, I set out along a village road leading to Volosovo. Crowds of refugees were streaming in the opposite direction, children, adolescents, women and old men. The people were tired, the children were crying, they were thirsty. The mothers were urging them to hold on just a little longer, trying to get as far away as possible. The people were exhausted, often abandoning their meagre belongings by the side of the road. On the edge of a ditch, an elderly woman was sitting with two girls. She gave me a friendly look and asked, "Heading to the front, sonny?" "To the front line trenches, mammy." "What's with that leg?" It was wounded. The woman shifted her exhausted gaze to the dusty road, along which refugees were constantly moving. Toe-weeded girls were sitting on either side of the old woman. One was about 8 to 10 years of age. She was holding a bundle on her lap and squinting from the bright sun, watching the men, women and children cutting across a field. The other girl, about 5 or 6 years old, having laid her curly-haired head on the lap of her grandmother, was sleeping. I saw her smiling at someone or something in her sleep. But when the smile faded, her face became almost like that of a distressed adult. The little girl woke up from some artillery explosions, but her eyes were continuing to struggle with sleep. Finally, catching sight of me, an armed man in a uniform, the little girl huddled closely against her grandmother and wrapped her little arms around the old woman's neck. She looked at me frowningly with wide, hate-filled eyes. She thought I was a German. "Why are you so frightened, Reiske? He's one of ours." The girl's gaze softened. She immediately relaxed and again laid her little head on her grandmother's lap, watching me out of the corners of her eyes. Not far from the road, some boys on horseback were driving a herd of cows across a field. "You see, Sonny, we stay close to the herd," the old woman spoke up, addressing me. She gave a caress to the head of her granddaughter with her dry, wrinkled hand. "We have no hot meals. We live on the milk." The older girl now and then touched the cover of my sniper's rifle with her little hand and looked at me affectionately. In these moments, it was as if I was seeing the Ukraine, Belarusia, and the lands of Smolensk enveloped in the flames of war. Our wives, children, fathers, and mothers, having abandoned their homes, were now resignedly trudging along the dusty roads into the country's interior, in order there to help us with their labour in our struggle against the fascist hordes. Perhaps my own mother was now walking in this same way down a different dusty road. The old woman looked at me with wise, kind eyes, and as if reading my thoughts, sighed deeply. "It's hard for you to fight, dears, but it is also difficult for us. Oh, how difficult. I'm trying to make my way to Leningrad with my granddaughters. Their father is at the front and their mother was killed during a bombing." Artillery salvos thundered in the distance. The old woman hastily grabbed the hands of the little girls, gave me a quick nod goodbye, and quickly set off into the woods. On the village road, the people also quickened their pace, glancing backward in fright. At Volosovo station, I encountered an unusual procession. 2 burly old men and several women armed with hatchets and pitchforks were leading 4 bedraggled, filthy German soldiers. 2 carts, loaded with boxes of shells, brought up the rear of this procession. A crowd of women and children, buzzing like agitated bees, were swarming around the little column. Falling in behind this strange procession were Red Army soldiers heading towards the front. I also joined the crowd. We stopped in a little village. From somewhere an empty box appeared from among the cases of shells. An excited young woman clambered up on the box and looked spitefully at the Germans. "Comrades!" the woman shouted. "There they are, Hitler's heroes. He dropped them on us in parachutes." Rumours of German paratroop drops were rife among the population in the summer of 1941. In the daytime they hid in a haystack like mice, but at night they fired on our villages and roads. They were trying to create panic. The Red Army soldiers began talking among themselves. A spunky woman. "Those old guys, strong like oaks." Interesting. How did they catch them? Guessing the thoughts of those present, the woman appealed to one of the old men. "Uncle Mika, tell the comrades how you tracked down these vipers." The thick-set, with shoulders as broad as a door, and pale as the moon Uncle Mika, bewildered by all the attention, was shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "There's nothing really to say," he softly said. "Anyone would have done it. It was just before dawn, and the first roosters had only begun to crow. I couldn't sleep. Worry was gnawing at my heart. What would our lives be like if the German comes? I stepped out for some fresh air. The forest was quiet. I walked over to the brook, thinking I'd have a little sit. Just then there was a gunshot. I think, who's doing this firing? I crossed the brook on a board and entered the glade next to the gully. A haystack was standing there, just as it is now. I was about to head back to my forest hut when suddenly there was a movement in the haystack. Aha, I think, something fishy is going on here. Our own guys wouldn't hide in haystacks and fire on places at night. I quickly, or at least as fast as I could manage, ran back to the village and roused the people. At dawn we walked up to the gully and grabbed them. Uncle Mika shot a suspicious glance at the Germans. A dastardly people. In a word, rats. I was just about to leave when I unexpectedly caught sight of Sergeant Akimov in the crowd. He also noticed me. Akimov ran up to me and almost knocked me off my feet. "Friend." He tightly embraced me. "We meet again. You're alive. Well, that's great. We've often been thinking about you." Akimov was a young, slender, well-built man, blessed with fine features on his slightly elongated face. The guys all loved the sergeant, and everyone, even the officers, called him affectionately our Akimich. By nature, Akimov was a cheerful, clever fellow, but in battle he was a tough and capable fighter. Everyone especially respected him for the fact that wherever Akimich might be, he would never leave behind a comrade in distress. "Well, what fates have brought you here, so far in the rear?" I asked the sergeant. "What rear? The bullets might not be whistling, but there are more than enough shell fragments." On the edge of the forest, we took a seat on the grass. Akimov propped his rifle between his knees, took off his forage cap, turned it inside out, and wiped his sweaty face with it. Having rested a bit, we went back out onto the road, and by evening we had successfully reached our company area. The reunion with my combat friends was noisy, with lots of embraces and kisses. During the war, I more than once had to part from my comrades. The parting was always sad, as if I was losing my dearest friends, but the return to my combat family was always joyful, even though death was always around us. I reported to my company commander on my return from the hospital. Kruglov, smiling, firmly embraced me. "I'm very happy that you've come back. After all, there's only a few of us veterans left." The senior lieutenant remembered something and took me by the arm. "We're going now to the battalion commander. He has a gift for you." Kruglov pointed at my left breast. "He fight for the wooded hill." Our defensive line in the area of Volosovo station was separated from the enemy by a dense, mixed forest. At 6 o'clock one morning, enemy artillery and bombers began to work over the station. Our artillerymen and bomber pilots targeted the enemy's positions in return. This duel continued all morning. The infantry and tanks on both sides took no part in this fighting. Small groups of enemy scouts were operating in the forest. The enemy was showing particular interest in some wooded knolls lying in front of our positions. This interest was understandable to us. Possession of these low hills would give the Germans a great view of our lines, and would allow them to fire on targets in our rear from machine guns and mortars. The fighting for Volosovo station indeed began precisely in the area of these wooded hills. Chistyakov's battalion was ordered to cover all the approaches to these knolls and to hold them for as long as possible. Our company was to make a sweep around one of the hills on its western side and to screen a dirt road. The company exited its trenches by platoon and quickly crossed some open terrain. When we reached the edge of the forest, we unexpectedly heard a single rifle shot ahead of us, and then everything around us again fell silent. Not a rustle, not a shout. We entered the woods at the sound of the shot and soon encountered Petrov, the scout platoon commander. "Who fired?" asked Kruglov. "It was the sniper Ulyanov, likely hunting some wood grouse." We found the sniper Ulyanov standing by an enormous fir tree with his rifle in the trail position. A body was laying in front of him, dressed in camouflage the same colour as the branches of the fir tree. Kruglov walked up to Ulyanov. The sniper looked guiltily into the eyes of the commander, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, as if he had some heavy burden on his back. Then, furrowing his brows and through his teeth, he said, "Comrade Commander, I know I mustn't make any sounds, but there was no other way around this." I asked him to climb down from the tree properly, but he didn't listen to me and kept shouting, hunched over a radio. So I had to fire once. Kruglov looked cheerfully at Ulyanov. "But we were told you were shooting wood grouse." The sniper shot a glance over at the platoon commander Petrov. Giving Ulyanov's hand a friendly shake, the senior lieutenant thanked the sniper for his vigilance and asked, "But where's the radio that you took from him?" Ulyanov handed his rifle over to Private Kotov and then quickly and agilely climbed the tree. When the radio had been retrieved, Kotov, returning the rifle to Ulyanov, whispered angrily, "What kind of tiger devil are you that you couldn't take him alive? Don't you see what's going on around here?" Ulyanov snarled, "Why are you pestering me? A tiger man, a tiger man. I had to eliminate him, so I fired." The presence of an enemy radio operator in our zone once again confirmed that the Germans had set their sights on these wooded hills. Kruglov called the attention of the platoon commanders to the fact that the German radio operator had undoubtedly reported that the commanding height had been occupied by the Russians, which meant that the adversary would soon begin to bomb it. The company commander ordered Petrov to take his men off the hill and pull them back to the dirt road. We moved on and reached the western slopes of the hill, where we began to wait for the return of our scout team, which was operating ahead of the company. Polytruk Vasilev asked Ulyanov, "Is it true that you like to treat yourself to forest creatures?" Ulyanov's entire face lightly flushed, and his thick, dark eyebrows rose. He didn't hurry with his reply. The political officer's question reminded him of his days before the war, when he would go on hunts in the taiga and bring back a bountiful bag to his mother. They lived together, just the two of them. His father was killed by kulaks, literally a prosperous farmer, but the term became extended to anyone who opposed collectivization during the time of collectivization. The entire burden of the household and care for his mother lay on his shoulders. He loved to hunt and was a crack shot. "Yes, comrade Polytruk, whatever I could get. As it happened, my mother made meals of wood grouse, snipes or partridges, of everything that ranged in our district. But here, look, one has to hunt for other game." With his eyes, Ulyanov indicated the dead German soldier and continued, "But you can't make a meal from this creature. It only spoils the appetite." The sniper Bodrov ran up to the company commander and hastily reported, "The Germans in about company strength are moving through a ravine in the direction of the hill." At this moment, several German Stukas appeared in the sky. Making a steep turn over the hill, they went into their bombing runs. One question was in all our minds. Had Petrov had time to move his men off the hill? The enemy dive bombers, their yellow surfaces flashing in the sun, began to release their loads. The whistle of the falling bombs and the hollow crump of their explosions didn't frighten us. We'd become accustomed to them. The soldiers lay down around tree trunks and hugged the earth, without taking their eyes off the ravine. Soon after the bombing, Germans began to emerge from the ravine. They were moving in a deployed formation, their guns at the ready. Soon they had drawn quite near to us. Their pale, sweating faces were clearly visible. The Germans were swinging their guns from side to side as they advanced. We opened up, and our rifle volleys merged into a prolonged storm of fire. The Germans, having lost a good half of their soldiers, bolted at a run back into the ravine and followed it back into the forest. The slopes of the ravine were strewn with corpses. I was firing at a fascist officer who was walking behind the line of his soldiers. Later, we saw bloodstains from 5 bullets in his chest. That meant I wasn't the only one shooting at him. Without wasting any time, we headed for the southern slopes of the hill. Along the route, we bumped into the scout Rumyantsev. He was escorting a German prisoner who was carrying a radio. "We didn't detect the enemy movement in our direction," Rumyantsev reported. "But this guy," and he pointed at the prisoner, "we caught in a raspberry patch. The red-headed devil, he wanted to snack on some raspberries. When we took him, he offered no resistance and said he was a communist. He speaks Russian well." Prisoners captured in these circumstances were usually sent immediately back to battalion headquarters without any interrogation. But for some reason, Kruglov didn't send this prisoner back right away. Turning to Vasilev, he asked, "Doesn't it seem to you that this young fellow could have been operating as a pair with the Fritz Ulyanov shot? Perhaps he lost the connection with him and wanted to check on what was going on. We need to find out." The senior lieutenant ordered his signalman Viktorov and me to escort the prisoner back to the location of the dead German's body. The prisoner took one glance at the face of the radio operator, then turning to Viktorov, he asked, "How did he wind up here? He's a radio operator from our regiment." "There's no way for me to know, but if you had asked for the circumstances of his death, that's a different matter. Did you serve together with him? Was he also a communist?" "No, but he was a good young man." "Do you have any documents? Prove to us that you're a communist. Do you have even your soldier's booklet?" "The company commander has the soldier's booklet. I didn't have time to get it because I was in a big hurry." "In order to find out the reason for the sudden silence from this radio operator on your line of advance?" "Yes, but this was only a pretext. Otherwise, how could I have crossed over to your side?" "You grabbed the radio as a cover too." We listened to the German and didn't know whether to believe him or not. Perhaps he had called himself a communist just to save his own skin. Later, I learned that at division headquarters he was revealed to be a dangerous enemy scout. Squad Commander Akimov returned from reconnaissance. He ran up to the company commander and reported, "Germans are moving in an extended column to our east. I couldn't establish their strength." "Keep them under observation," ordered the senior lieutenant, "while we decide what to do." Akimov disappeared into the forest. "The situation has become complicated," Kruglov said, turning to the politruk. "You kill some, while others slip away into the woods. The fighting will go on indefinitely, and this is extremely unfavourable for us." The company commander was perceptibly nervous. Then Kruglov turned to his platoon commanders. "The enemy has changed his tactics, so we must now do the same. We'll let the Germans reach the base of the hill. The woods are sparser there, and we'll attack them from the rear. We'll cut off their path of retreat and destroy them before larger German forces come up." Our riflemen split into two groups and took cover in the bushes. The Germans were advancing with great caution, stopping frequently to listen to the forest sounds. Again we could see their pale faces and alert eyes. When the last enemy soldier, bringing up the rear of the German column, had passed us, at the command of the senior lieutenant we opened fire. Taking cover behind trees, the Germans resisted furiously, but squeezed by us from two sides, the column was destroyed. This time, though, we didn't get by without our own losses. As soon as we had finished dealing with this second enemy grouping, Kruglov quickly started to lead the company to the dirt road where we were supposed to meet up with the other companies of our battalion. Just as we were moving out from where we had ambushed the German column, heavy machine guns began to chatter from the hilltop. We couldn't determine their direction of fire, but they weren't firing at us. Kruglov issued an order to platoon commander Viktorov. "Immediately send some men to find out who's on top of the hill. If the enemy has got past us, don't engage them and come back." The commander dropped to one knee, pulled out a map, and again examined the terrain around these wooded hills. The soldiers sat and lay around on the grass, conversing softly and smoking. The machine guns on the hill continued their heavy fire. Had the Germans engaged other companies of our battalion? Where were Petrov's scouts? Why had there been no word from them? This uncertainty alarmed not only the commander, but also each soldier. We knew that in a forest 1 minute can mean the difference between success and complete failure. Soon Viktorov reported that our battalion was locked in combat with the Germans on the slopes of the hill. Petrov's platoon was keeping watch over the dirt road. Senior Lieutenant Kruglov seemed to be waiting just for this report. Quickly sticking his map back into its case, he said, "We're heading for the dirt road." A runner from Petrov's platoon came running up. "Enemy reconnaissance is moving along the edge of the forest in the direction of the dirt road," he announced. "What are your orders? Open fire or let them pass?" "Let the reconnaissance element pass and wait for the approach of larger forces. You, Politruk Vasilev, go to Vladimirov's platoon. Sidorov and Pilyushin will accompany you. If something happens, you can find me with Viktorov's platoon. We'll deal with the German reconnaissance element later." Vladimirov's platoon was situated in a large forest clearing, through which ran the dirt road. The platoon commander was located in the centre of his riflemen's positions, several meters from the road. Vasilev lay down next to the young but courageous and experienced sniper Borisov. Borisov's sniper teammate, Sinitsyn, lay 5 meters away from us. "Well, tell me, how are things going for you here?" the Polytruk asked the sniper team. Borisov glanced at his friend Sinitsyn, from whom he never parted, neither in hours of rest nor in combat, before replying, "Everything's okay, Comrade Polytruk. If they'll just come a little closer, we'll give them a good thrashing." "And if there are a lot of them, what then?" "We won't retreat, Comrade Polytruk. Here in the woods, you can't take shelter behind a tank, but you can find it behind a tree. Something else is troubling us, Comrade Polytruk. We are now not far from Leningrad." There was a long minute of silence. Sinitsyn broke the pause in conversation. "We have, Comrade Polytruk, how to say, a militant mindset and a great desire to stop the German advance. Otherwise, wherever the Fritzes have trod, whatever piece of our land they have seized, you see our people there are living under fascist captivity. It's hard, oh so hard, for a man who has lost his freedom to live." Borisov's face was flushed and his eyes were burning. He moved a little closer to the Polytruk, as if fearing that the enemy might overhear their conversation. "Our commander, just like you, Comrade Polytruk, is demanding that we act decisively. Each shot fired must have a purpose. We riflemen like an order like this, and we are carrying it out. But you see, to retreat is very hard on us. All sort of thoughts crawl into your head." I always remembered this friendly conversation between the Red Army soldiers and the Polytruk. Simple men were expressing their innermost thoughts. They were ready to stand to the death against any force, if only to stop the enemy advance as quickly as possible, and to hurl him from our land. The discussion was interrupted by the appearance of the Nazis. Everyone froze. The fascists were moving towards the clearing in a column, confident that there were no Russians here. Sniper Sinitsyn swore, "They've finally gone too far, the swine. They're moving at the front in columns." Hugging the earth and breathing shallowly, I lay there with my eyes focused on the column. It seemed that if you blinked an eye, the Germans would spot you, and if you took a deeper breath, they'd hear you. Now they were quite near, moving slowly, their heads swivelling as they searched the surrounding woods. 3 ambulances at the rear of the column now entered the clearing, one after the other. The German column was not less than battalion strength. Then suddenly a green rocket soared into the sky. The Nazis momentarily stopped and looked at the slowly falling signal rocket. We opened up, and the fire from our light machine guns and rifles tore into their column. Our attack was so strong and unexpected that the enemy could not immediately organize resistance. Those who remained unharmed started to run back, firing wildly, and soon disappeared into the forest. After about 10 to 15 minutes, they attacked again, this time enveloping the forest clearing on 2 sides. Field grey uniforms flashed among the trees. In a low crouch, the soldiers were running from cover to cover, hiding behind trees and firing. "Look, they know how to cower," Borisov shouted. "This looks like something completely different from when they had thought to parade around in columns." Then the sniper resumed sending bullet after bullet at the Nazis. A messenger from Krugloff came running up to the Polytruk.